I'm having a weird geek moment between stuff that I'm learning about biomechanics and like general commentary about society. So bear with me a second here. So one of the things we learn about in the biomechanics stuff I'm learning now is this idea of relative motion versus orientation. So orientation is going to be what you look like visually when you're doing, say, some sort of exercise, like a squat or something. And then relative motion is going to be the motion between not necessarily your muscles always, but the relative motion between your skeletal frame, between your bones. Because your muscles sit on your bones, they pull your bones around, but your bones themselves are the framework that your muscles sit on, right? They're just the rigid frame on which our muscles just kind of sit. And our muscles just know to be in certain positions of contraction by default that allow us to stand upright, right? Because otherwise, and our skeleton is doing a lot of that work because it's a rigid frame that knows how to keep us upright, and then our muscles just kind of fill in the blanks as needed, and that's how we've kind of evolved. And so one of the things we're learning is this idea that when people who come in with specific injuries or need corrective exercise or have certain movement patterns that are inhibiting their maximum capacity, a lot of the times their orientation may look correct, but they are lacking the relative motion to access that orientation. So because of that, because they're lacking the relative motion to access orientation, they visually might be checking off orientation and form, but they are having to compensate in relative motion to access that orientation. So for example, this would be someone doing like a very deep squat who we always talk about having ankle mobility, but if you also don't have the correct actual hip mobility and hip flexion, you are not going to internally rotate when you need to or externally rotate when you need to support that orientation or the form. Okay, I've stuck under 2 minutes, so I think I'm doing a good job. Anyways, one of the things that I've been thinking about is this idea that social media is a place, like it used to be a place that we could go to. I think there's a lot of commentary about this now. I've been getting a lot of videos where you can say stuff like BRB, gotta go, talk to you later. And the internet was a place you could come and go from. But now it is an inherent aspect of our lives. And because of that, I think what occurs in us at like a kind of a macro scale of human social relationships, I recently watched the latest Huberman episode, so that has informed a little bit of this dialogue. It's with Dr. K. Tai, and it's an incredible episode. Anyways, because that the internet is a place now, we are constantly kind of perceiving ourselves in orientation. Where do we stack on the hierarchy? Where do we stack socially? Where do we stack among our friends? Where are we oriented relative to where we should be or where we could be? Or where we would be if something, hadn't happened, if we hadn't had this particular interaction or event in our lives and so on. But because of that, we run away from embracing active change internally, which I guess here I'm trying to make the analogy that is relative motion. Internal change and your individuality that exists while, interacting with society is your relative motion. It's you going kind of in and out, and you are having that safety, security, and stability in yourself when you're interacting amongst society, which tells you what your orientation is. So maybe the biomechanics part didn't need to be said, but for me, that's the terminology that I'm working with for this analogy. And so with relative motion, again, the things that you learn is, for example, if your, say, hip is internally rotated, sometimes people need to be put into further positions to access the ability to externally rotate. So it's like this idea that you might already be, say, clenching, but from here you are relaxing. Here is relaxed, but this process from contraction to relaxation, the two states, is relaxing. And the same way to go from the relaxation state to the contraction state, you are contracting. And so it's recognizing not the orientation of the two states, but rather what is the motion that's happening. Because, for example, from here, I can say that I'm contracted a bit, but I am further contracting. Or from a semi-contracted position, I'm further relaxing. Maybe I'm getting too biomechanicsy for this, but I think it's holding on. So it's like internally, we're always changing. We always have relative motion. There's these quotes, which is like, sometimes giving 100% of yourself every day might be someone else's like 50%. Or for you itself, giving 100% at something might mean, it might mean 50% relative to the day before, or 120% relative to the day before. So it's this idea of constantly keeping in mind where you are, where you're going, and kind of where you've been in a way. And that I think is accepting the idea of dynamic change and understanding that you yourself are always relatively moving from where you were yesterday, from where you were a week ago, from where you were way before that. But because of social media and because of the internet and because of accessibility to us or accessibility to other people, or even just access to information that, you want to seek out, you're always in this state of looking at yourself from where others are. And that's a lot of what I think people who don't like being perceived have too, is that they feel in that moment, by being perceived, they have been put into an orientation that they don't want to be in. And that, I think, is kind of a huge lesson to learn overall, is that orientation is where you are. And that's still important. They're like events, and you still have to consider that, right? It's like you can say, oh, I'm relatively great at this, but sometimes if that's not getting you a job, you got to look at orientation and say, okay, I need to stack up to here and build that. But by seeing yourself in relative motion of where you are dynamically, you understand how to get to that orientation. Whereas if you're just kind of doing orientation to orientation, you might not be looking at yourself necessarily. Maybe I'm starting to get too metaphysical here. Maybe I've done too much meditation. But it's like if you are jumping from event to event of orientation, you might not look at yourself or give yourself that kind of, freedom to succeed, to fail, to not succeed as much as you thought you were going to succeed, because you're only concerned with where you're going from an orientation to an orientation, an event to an event, and that your form is good. But instead, if you focus on, or at least are able to be cognizant of relative motion as often as possible, you know what your full range of motion is, right? Because if my relative motion limits me from doing a full squat, then even if I can do a good squat with good form, I'm likely seeking some compensation that I'm unaware of, that I'm not taking account of. And that's kind of what happens with mental health, is that when you are jumping from state to state, always kind of looking for the next thing, you're on the internet, always comparing yourself to someone else, you are not really aware of where your ability to get there is. We often misjudge that. You might think, there's no way I could live that person's life. But if you look at your own life, you might feel, oh, I actually have all of the pieces that I need to put together to be that. But when you just look at it straight out, you might think, I could never achieve that kind of thing. And there's another quote that influences this particular mini rant, which is like, there are people out there who, if they could trade lives with you, are likely living their dream lives, even no matter what you think of your own life. And because of that, I think it emphasizes even more how orientation is the worldview we're stuck in. We're kind of always looking at going from event to event. But if we're able to consider the relative motion that we have, the fact that our full range of motion might not be the full range of motion, but by doing our 100%, you can train to access that oriented 100%, that full range of motion that everyone else says is full range of motion. And I don't know, it's just kind of, there's a lot of activism that I'm finding out is very intersectional, especially as a former medical student engineer, and then I recently turned to tech a little bit, but then the awareness of it has I don't know, it's put me in a weird spot. But that's where I really enjoy studying the human body and like how to help people from that perspective, because I think it helps the same way there's mental health. I think physical health and mental health are interrelated, and I think a lot of the lessons we can learn from learning so much about physical health do translate conceptually to mental health. And I took way longer than I thought, but I think I did the first part in like 2 minutes, so that's hopefully concise. But anyways, Finn, thank you.